So I'm hoping to get through two Psalms today, Psalm 45 and Psalm 68. And if we do that, we will only be one Psalm behind last quarter. And we've had one less class this quarter, so I'm pretty impressed with that. And then next week, I'd like to do more of a review and kind of wrap up. And we'll be talking about some of the themes that we saw in the Psalms that we did cover this quarter. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go right into Psalm 45, a royal wedding song, or Your Throne is Forever. It is widely held that this is a song, a structure very similar to that of the Song of Solomon. And the NIV, I think, actually in the header talks about this specifically being a wedding song. And it's conveniently kind of, there's two halves to it. The first half talks about the king, who is the groom, and the second half talks about the bride-to-be. So with that, who has verses 1 through 9 for us? Okay, so a while back we talked about, remember how the Jews would interpret the Old Testament contextually, so that it would have a meaning that would kind of evolve over time. Not necessarily evolve, but meanings that would be revealed over time as there was a new set of context. So, you might view a psalm one way when it was originally written. You might view it completely differently when Christ comes, right? Because you suddenly realize, oh, this was talking about the Messiah. And I think this is one of those as well, because I believe from what I read that they would sing this as part of the, sort of wedding ceremony of a king getting married. So it had application to them in that time, but they also understood that it had more far-reaching meaning to it than that. The interesting thing about this, for me, is it starts out by talking about this king, right? The king and his beauty. It says that he is the most handsome among men. Do you see any language in this part of the psalm that really, other than it saying that you are most handsome, is there any other language here that talks about his features and why he's handsome? Is he tall? Is he muscular? Does he have the perfect asymmetrical, or not asymmetrical, that'd be a Picasso, symmetrical facial features? Is anything like that at all in the psalm? No, there's nothing there. So why do you think that he's calling the king the most handsome of men? What does it talk about? Yeah, so in other words, it's more about his character and his nature than it is about maybe his physical features, right? It talks about him being a mighty warrior with a sword at his side, and it talks about how he rides victorious for truth and righteousness. And this language, this imagery should seem familiar to us. Who has Revelation 19:11 through 16? Can read that for us. Okay, so who's this talking about in Revelation? What was that, Shaney? Jesus is always the answer. Yes, Jesus is the answer to that question. Revelation is talking about Jesus. And it uses the same language that we see here in Psalm 45, right? He is a mighty warrior. He is victorious. He has a sword. It's a sword of truth, a very powerful weapon, right? This is the same kind of language that we see here in Psalm. Is there any way we can turn the air off? I don't know. Do we need like Rick's permission? I'm having a hard time hearing, and I don't know if everybody else is or not. If so, that would be great. If not, I understand. Okay, so then it goes on to talk about the king and his rule. Oh, I didn't know Rick was in here. Thank you, Rick. And it says, the king rules forever and ever. And how do you think that they would have viewed that in a non-messianic perspective? When they were singing this song at the wedding of a king in Israel, that phrase, the king rules forever and ever, how do you think that they would have thought of that? Probably more like a long live the king kind of thing, right? But we know that when we take this and we apply it to Christ, that his rule truly is forever, for all eternity. It says that he has been anointed by God, and there's actually a little bit of confusion if you kind of look up commentaries on this. In verse 6, it says, your throne, O God, and that's the word Elohim, and we've talked about that word quite a bit in this class. And then also again in verse 7, it says, therefore, Elohim, your Elohim. So it's very clear that this passage is referencing Christ, and we do know that Christ himself was anointed by God the Father. So God the Son anointed by God the Father. How else do we know that this is referring to Christ? There's one clear way, especially when you look at verse 6. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness. Where have we heard that before? Ooh, I can hear now. It's in Hebrews, says the Hebrews teacher. Yes. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 8, when it talks about Christ being superior to the angels, literally quotes this psalm. So it's quoting this psalm as a proof that Christ is superior to the angels, talking about his scepter of uprightness and how he loves righteousness and hates wickedness. Then it closes out this section of the psalm by talking about, from ivory palaces, stringed instruments make you glad. And it kind of struck me as I was reading that this is a psalm, a messianic psalm. We're talking about Christ, and it talks about him glad. But my question to you for consideration here for a couple of minutes is, isn't he called the man of sorrows? I'm currently in the Isaiah class. You guys had the Isaiah class last quarter. Isaiah 53:3. What does it call him? The man of sorrows, right? He was acquainted with pain. He was acquainted with grief and suffering. So how is he glad? Is this a contradiction here? Okay. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we oftentimes we focus a lot on his sorrow, which I think is very important, on his grief. He certainly was sorrowful that many of the nation of Israel did not believe in him. His own friends turned against him. There was a lot that happened in his ministry that he was sorrowful for. He wants us all to be saved. So even if one person doesn't make it to heaven, he's going to be sorrowful for that. But he rejoices in the work of his Father. He's glad when we are obedient and when we do name him as our Lord and Savior and are baptized. You know, that work made him very joyous, the joy of the Lord, right? He's very joyful when we obey, and he's looking forward to being with us for all eternity. And I think it's important for us to remember that aspect of who he is as well. Any thoughts on the first half of the psalm before we move on to the bride? Okay, who has verses 10 through 17 for us? Okay, so if the first half of the psalm is about the king, and we say that the king is, in fact, the Messiah, Jesus, and the second half is about the bride, who is the bride? The church, right? So when we read this and talk about this section, we're not only talking about the bride marrying the king of the people, we're talking about the church, we're talking about us. So this is key to like really pay attention, right? Really pay attention to what's being said here because it's being said to us. And so it starts off by telling the bride to forget the past. And this should sound familiar to us as Christians, as members of the church. Forget your family in the past, right? Same concept we see in Luke 14. If you don't give up mother and father and brother and sister, then you can't follow the king. So you have to give up your past. You have to give up your family. Also, it says your new life is with the king. This is talked about in Philippians 3. Looking forward to a new life. So don't look back at the past. Look forward to a new life. And then submit and show reverence and honor. So all of the things that the bride is being told here about her new life as the queen married to the king, the same messages that we should take as members of the church. Forget about our old life, the way we used to live, the way we used to talk and think and act, and now look forward to the way we're going to behave, patterned after the king. And my question this morning is, did the Israelites follow this advice? This was, originally written to them. Did they follow this? Yeah, mostly no. Yeah, mostly no, right? And we can think of some examples in the Old Testament where this is not true. Immediately after God delivers them from Egypt, what do? They look back. We had it better off. The food was better, and we had nice, comfy beds. They were looking backwards at their life prior to being delivered by God the Father, and instead of thinking about their new life as His chosen people, instead of thinking about how He would make a nation of them. Another example, smaller example, I guess, would be Lot's wife. Looking back, got turned into a pillar of salt. Can you think of any other examples? I don't have one in mind. I'm just throwing it out there. Yes, that's right. It does, absolutely. Yeah, so Jesus Himself warned about that. Yes. Right, which is why when the new covenant was fully established, they no longer had the ability to do that, right? And so they physically can't look back at that today. Yeah, that's a great point. Any other thoughts? Okay, so look to the future. That's the message here, right? And in the future, it says the bride is going to be clothed in beauty. Her life is going to be filled with joy and gladness. Her sons will be made princes. And I'd like to go back to Revelations 19. We read that earlier to show the similar language to Christ. Let's read it again, now looking at the bride. Who has verses 6 through 8? Right, so again, similar language, talking about the bride, talking about the church. And this paints a very rosy picture, doesn't it? Clothed in beauty, filled with joy and gladness. Anybody feel like they're filled with joy and gladness? Maybe sometimes, maybe not all the time. Which leads me to my question is looking forward always easy? Is it ever easy? Maybe. Sometimes you feel like things are going well and you're like, okay, I think I'm getting a hang of this, but then, life throws you a curveball. Looking forward is not easy, I don't think. It's hard to perceive past the immediate, right? We're constantly, and we were talking about this last night. We live in a society that's all about instant gratification. I want, the Veruca salt. I want it now, kind of tendencies. But as the church, as the bride of Christ, we are told to look forward, and we know that we will be clothed in beauty. We will be filled with joy and gladness, not just in the moment, but for all eternity. So this is a very hopeful psalm. I think it's one that I'll probably turn back to from time to time. It's pretty short, but it's packed with some pretty powerful lessons. Any other thoughts on this before we move on? All right, let's go to Psalm 68. God's majestic power. Or God shall scatter his enemies. Who has verse 1 through 6?
God shall arise. Enemies shall be scattered, and those who hate him shall flee before him. As smoke is driven away, so he shall drive them away. As wax melts before fire, so the wicked shall perish before God. But the righteous shall be glad, and they shall exult before God. They shall be God, sing praises to his name, lift up a song to him who rides in the desert. His name is the Lord, exalt before him. Fathers of the fatherless, protectors of widows, in God, in his holy habitation. God settles the solitary in a home. He leads out the prisoners in prosperity, but the rebellious dwell in
I wish I had planned this. I couldn't have planned it any better asking Todd to read this section, because I love how you said God in a very loud voice. This chapter starts with the word God. What other book of the Bible or chapter in the Bible do we know starts with the word God? What's that? In the beginning, God. What else? I'm looking at Scott Foster and Phil. Why would I look at Scott Foster and Phil? God, who at sundry times, yes, really gets your attention when you start something with God. God shall arise. Okay, you got my attention. Why is he arising, right? What's this talking about? So it's like Hebrews. It begins with the word God. When he arises, his enemies are going to flee. And that's interesting imagery, right? You get this idea of they're all kind of scattered around his feet, maybe planning things and scheming things and plotting against him. And then he stands up and it's like, oh no, let's run away because he's going to get us. They get comfortable when he sits, but very nervous when he stands up. And it says that he is going to blow his enemies away like smoke. They're going to be melted like wax in front of a fire. And we see the same kind of language in Numbers 10, verses 35 and 36. Who has that? Did I hand that out? Numbers 10, 35 through 36.
whenever the ark set out.
Okay. So it's the same language about the ark that we see here in Psalm 68 about God. And why does that make sense? Why would you hear the same language about the ark? It's the presence of God, right? And so when the ark went out in front of the people, it was God going out in front of the people, right? And so it's just confirmation of this idea that when God stands up and goes out, all of his enemies flee. And I think I already kind of beat myself to the punch here around what image does this conjure up. But it's this idea of, kind of like flipping on the light switch and all the cockroaches go. Any other thoughts on this section? Okay, so it then goes on to talk about God's righteousness. It says, exalt him who rides on the clouds. What do you think that means? Rides on the clouds. Okay, so this is my best guess at this, especially given that the language in Numbers with the ark is the same language here for God. When the Israelites were in the wilderness, how did the ark move? It followed the cloud, but also who carried it? What was that? The Levites, right? The priests, the Levites, right? So imagine how many there are. I can't remember how many Israelites there were, but walking through the wilderness, carrying the ark, all of those footsteps on the wilderness ground, clouds of dust rising up. If you're looking from afar, and remember a lot of these kings of the nations in what would become the promised land are watching from afar because they're worried about what's this nation going to do that's coming out of Egypt. It would look like the ark was kind of riding on a cloud. That's my guess, right? I think it's also good to talk about God in front of them as a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. But this idea that God is riding on this cloud as he's guiding his children, his chosen ones through the wilderness and taking care of them, right? Because it says he is the father of the fatherless and the protector of widows. He provides homes for the deserted, and he leads prisoners to prosperity. My question here for us to consider is, can we relate to this language? Do we think about God in these terms? I'll talk about one aspect of this in more detail here in a minute, but specifically this section here: father of fatherless, protector of widows, provides homes, lead prisoners. Do we think about God in those terms? Yes, absolutely. I think another thing here too is I've talked a lot about mindset and how important your mindset is. Changing your mindset can draw you closer to God. I think if we think about ourselves in these terms, or more importantly, think about God in these terms. So if you are, this time of year is a difficult time of year for a lot of people because they don't have the family relationships that you normally think of, the perfect Christmas and the family comes home and everyone loves each other and there's no arguments and all of that good stuff. You don't have that. Maybe you've lost your parents, maybe whatever it is, right? To think about God as being your family, being your father. I don't have a father here on this earth, but I have a father who's in heaven. If you're a widow or you're in dire straits, to think of him as protecting you. Remember, visualization is an important thing. We see David uses it all the time. Visualize him as your protector, as your father. Visualize him providing you with all of the things you need: your home, your clothes, your food. And then this last one I think is very important. Visualize yourself as a prisoner that has been let out of prison um, unfairly, really, and been led to prosper. Because every single one of us either was a prisoner or are currently a prisoner. Prisoner to sin and prisoner to death. And God freed us from that, and now we're prosperous. And going back to the last psalm, we can look forward to being clothed in beauty and having joy and gladness, etc. I think it's important. This is one of the ways that studying Psalms has really changed my prayer life, because now I think about God and my relation to him in different terms. Any other thoughts on this, Scott? Oh, yeah. Yeah, that'll be Christ reclaiming the rainbow when he comes again. Yeah, I like that. I think that's exactly right. This idea that we see throughout the entire story from beginning to end. Any other thoughts? Matt? Sorry. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Bill? Oh, yeah. Yeah, you want to just lead it for us? Actually, that would be, if we have time, that would be a good thing. Any other thoughts, Lisa? Yeah, right. Yeah, right. That's a great point. Yes, right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. In fact, that's an awesome segue to go into the next section. So, who has 7 through 14? Okay, so this king, or this God that we talked about arising, this righteous God who is protector of his people and all of his enemies fleeing, he is also a giver of blessings. And this section starts out by talking about how he is leading his people through the desert. It says that the earth trembled and rain poured. Now, it's an interesting thing that I learned here is that the word rain in this verse is not actually a direct translation of the original. The word rain in the original is not there, and translators add it to make it like flow or to kind of round it out, if you will. And one commentary I read said that they didn't think that the word rain belonged there. They thought that in their mind, what is going on here is this idea that all creation is bowing down to God. So God is leading his people through the wilderness. He is out in front. The enemies are fleeing, they're scattering, they're afraid, and nature itself is bowing down to him. The earth coming down and the earth trembling and the sky coming down because he is in control of it all. He created it all. Um, and then and then later it uses the word rain again in verse 9. It says rain in abundance. That word is in the original, and it's this idea that he is showering them with blessing. So he arises to lead them. All the enemies flee. All of creation bows down, and he uses that creation to bless his people. My question here is, you probably are going to guess it is, does God lead you this way? When you wake up in the morning and you say your morning prayer and you ask for God to guide you throughout the day, do you think about him standing out in front of you everywhere you go, and the earth trembling and the sky bowing down? Because if you can really feel that and think that as you go about your day, how much of a difference is that going to make in your confidence to get through whatever you encounter that day? Could you imagine what that would actually be like to be following God around in your day and everything is bowing towards him and all enemies flee for him? It's a pretty powerful idea, isn't it? Anybody have any? Yeah, yeah, Absolutely. Yeah, I actually saw this on TikTok of all places. But there's a lot of good Christian content on TikTok. The TikTok has so many different little, like, sort of niche communities, but the Christian TikTok is pretty nice. And this guy said to start your day by asking God to guide your words, your thoughts, and your steps, to send you where you needed to go to serve Him and to become more like Christ. And then to ask God to help you hear His voice above the sound, the lusts of the world, above the desire of your flesh, and above the voice of Satan who is seeking to devour you. To send His Spirit to dwell in you to pray on your behalf. To send His angels to encamp around you. Doing that, saying that out loud as a start of your day is going to totally change your mindset. Very. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's harder to give in to temptation when you've literally verbally asked God to help you hear His will over your own and to keep you from doing those things. Yeah, for sure. Any other thoughts? Okay, and then it talks about God as being the conquering God. Um, the news that comes back is that the enemies have fled before God, and the spoils of victory go to His people. That was the news then. That was the news when the Israelites were going through the wilderness, and God literally was leading the way. That the enemies fled, and the victory went to His people. What's the news today? The news today is that Jesus, the answer, is victorious. Jesus is victorious, right? And so the spoils of that victory are going to go to His people, which is us. Now, quick question. Verse 11, it says, the women who announced the news are a great host. Why does it call out women in verse 11? Because I've read that there's, and I can't remember now which one it is, but there's a translation that doesn't use the word women. And I think it was because they didn't like the imagery there, the women being the ones that announce the news and divide the spoils. Why do you think it is women? The women are who are there, yes. Yes, that's right. And literally, to your point, literally when this would happen in the Old Testament, where the Israelites would go and they would conquer and they would come back, it would be the women who would announce the news because they were the ones that were there. But the interesting thing is when you look in Matthew and Luke, the women were the ones proclaiming the victory of Jesus. He's risen. They were the ones. And so I think whoever the translator was that decided to take that out really did a disservice because there's a direct connection there between the way it was in the Old Testament and the way it happened in the New Testament when Christ was raised from the dead. All right, I'm going to go to in the interest of time, and we'll go straight into the next one. Who has verses 15 through 23? All right, so this is talking about the God in Zion. And it says, Mount Bashan is envious of Zion. Does anybody know what Mount Bashan is? It is a mountain that is northeast, I think, of Sea of Galilee. It's in the northern kingdom, right? Zion is in the southern kingdom, and it is a very impressive mountain. And in reality, Zion is more like a hill compared to Bashan. So, what does this say about God that he did not choose the most impressive mountain in the promised land, that he chose Zion instead? What does that say about it? I think that's right. Yeah, God has often chosen the thing that we would not have chosen, right? He uses um, perceived weakness to make a fool out of the strong. Um, it, he, the greatness that comes out of God comes straight from God, not the thing that he's using to deliver it, in other words, right? He used what men consider to be foolishness to kind of shame those who think that they're wise. We see that time and time again in God's word. Exactly. And even Christ, that there was nothing to speak of about his appearance, and yet he was the King of Kings, or is the King of Kings, right? So this is the way God operates. He is the God of salvation and death. God bears our burdens. And go back to Isaiah 53 and the following verses to what we mentioned before. It talks about he's the man of sorrows, but he's bearing our burdens and he's bearing our griefs. And we esteem him as stricken as a result, but really he's doing that for us. Only he can offer escape from death. Enemies are crushed and wicked are destroyed. And the sort of conclusion here is that total victory belongs to the king. Now, I want to take a minute to look at verse 18. Who has Ephesians 4, 8 through 14 for us? Yeah.
Therefore it says, "He sitteth on high, he led a host against them, saying, the Lord extended the might fill all things. He gave them work, building up the body of all that no longer be carried about by
Okay, so here again we see Psalms being quoted as a way to show that Christ is the Son of God. He is the Messiah. Verse 18, you ascended on high. Paul tells us what this means. It's about Jesus because he died and was raised again. He was resurrected. In this psalm, it talks about how the king ascends on high and gives gifts or receives gifts from men. But our king, the King of Kings, when he ascended on high, he gave gifts to us. And he gave gifts of apostles, prophets, evangelism, so that we would be equipped to carry on the work of the church after he rose and went to heaven. So, in interest of time, I'm going to go straight to the last section here. Who has 24 through 35? through 35? Yeah. All right, so this is a processional of praise. Praise is given from all people. Everyone from every tribe is assembled. Rulers of nations bring tribute to him. Kingdom is established and all are in subjection. My question for consideration as we close classes, has this happened yet? Not in David's time. Has it happened in our time? I mean, I personally think that it has happened. That Christ is now, all things are in subjection to Christ. That he obtained the ultimate victory through his resurrection. All right, we'll have to leave it there. Next class, we'll do the review. Thank you very much for your participation.